This amazing goal by Thiago Almada against Corinthians really sums up what we remember about him at Botafogo, right? And the start of the play helps refresh the memory for those who didn't follow that season closely. Check it out. Almada is this number 23 here, running through the middle. But if we remember well, that Botafogo used to play in a 4-2-3-1 formation. So Almada, even though he was a winger, played inside, and what we usually saw was this kind of dynamic. Since the winger moved inside, the one who took care of the flank was the fullback. And keep that in mind because it will be important later in the video. In this game, Marçal was playing, but usually the starting left back for Botafogo was Alex Telles. Botafogo tries to build up on the sides, the ball comes back, and Almada is exactly the guy who almost always makes this move, right? He's the winger who plays inside. At this point, you're already used to it, and several players do this. Even at Flamengo, Paquetá has already done this on the right, Arrascaeta has done this on the right, Plata has done this on the right. And for those who remember from older times, Everton Ribeiro does this too, also on the right side. The play continues, the ball switches sides, and then we see the other two midfielders from Botafogo. Savarino usually played as the number 10, more cerebral and central. Luis Henrique, the right winger, typically could go either way, whether going to the end line or cutting inside, mainly because he's left-footed and looks for the finish. Here, due to the situation and the circumstances of the play, he's over there on the left side. The play continues, comes back through the other channel, and the ball gets to Almada. And here, my friend, you can really see the difference here. Check this out. He controls it, fakes a right-footed shot. Because he's a right-footed left winger, he'll naturally have this movement to cut inside. He gets past the second defender and shoots with his left foot. The ball deflects, giving the goalkeeper no chance. This was the goal that secured Botafogo's win. This heat map you're seeing here is Almada's heat map for this match, which reinforces what I said, a left winger who cuts inside, but not just that. He also drops deep to the base of the play to see the game from the front. He's not a very physical player, so he's not the type to spend a lot of time in spaces where he'll be under more pressure. He prefers to escape the pressure so he can see the field and set the tempo, which raises the question. Knowing that Almada has this kind of characteristic, where is he going to fit into this Flamengo team under Leonardo Jardim? For me, there are three realistic options that also affect other players in the squad. And after thinking about it a lot, I think I have a definitive opinion. Come with me. This is the 4-2-3-1 formation that Flamengo fans are already getting used to in this Leonardo Jardim era. It's the same model he used as Cruzeiro's coach, which I followed closely. In fact, a good part of the ideas he used with his previous team, he's repeating now at Flamengo, obviously adapting to the players' profiles. And the first possibility when we think about Thiago Almada is for him to be exactly that left winger, taking Samuel Lino out of the starting lineup. Last season, with Felipe Luis, Lino had the role of being the wide player to stretch the field. Felipe Luis is a coach who prefers positional play. There's a video on the channel where I discuss the Spanish school and explain positional play in detail. Basically, Lino's role was to stretch the field and seek one-on-ones on the wing. The thing is, he didn't do that well. He arrived in the middle of last year, had a pretty inconsistent 6 months, didn't start the season very well, Felipe Luis leaves, Leonardo Jardim comes in, and Samuel Lino does really well under the Portuguese coach. Jardim debuts on March 8th against Fluminense 1-0. After that, Lino gets an assist, then scores against Cruzeiro, Botafogo, and Remo. He goes 3 games without scoring and doesn't play full minutes, sitting on the bench against Cusco at high altitude. 2 assists against Fluminense, 3 games without a goal contribution with only 11 minutes here against Vitória. 2 more assists against Atlético Mineiro. Here he has a slight dip, and then against Curitiba he scores 2 goals and gets an assist. Against River, a goal and an assist. Against Benfica, now in the friendly match, a goal. And against Chapecoense, in this return to the Brasileirão, an assist. More and more we've been seeing Samuel Lino with a new style of play. And I had already mentioned this here on the channel. At Cruzeiro, Jardim really liked having a forward who attacked the space behind the defense, who broke through a lot. And that guy was Caio Jorge. It's no wonder he became the top scorer of the last Brasileirão season, arriving at Flamengo and seeing that Pedro is a star, that he can't be left on the bench and doesn't really have that characteristic. He had to adapt his style of play. So, instead of having the number 9 run in behind the defense, he adapted it so that Samuel Lino would take on that role. And he's been doing really well. In other words, to sum it all up, Samuel Lino has become a very important player since Jardim arrived, and if before he was considered a player who wasn't that important, and that he would easily go to the bench, with the arrival of a player like Thiago Almada, Today I'm not so sure anymore. We're talking about 14 goal involvements. In the 24 games coached by Jardim, that's a little more than 1 goal involvement every 2 games. That's a pretty interesting number, especially when we're talking about a guy who's not even a center forward, not even a main striker. In other words, understanding that Lino is an important player on the left side, and that maybe he wouldn't lose his starting spot right away. We need to start imagining Almada playing in other positions, and another alternative is for him to play as a number 10 in Arrascaeta's place. He actually did that for Botafogo at times when Savarino wasn't available. Because he often moves from the outside in and drops deeper to start plays, he had no trouble playing as a number 10. He actually covered a lot of ground that season. Look, these are Almada's numbers in 2024, when he played both for Atlanta and for Botafogo. It was a season with 9 goals and 3 assists. For Botafogo, interestingly, it's only 3 goals and 2 assists in 16 plus 622. More games here in 23 matches, 3 goals and 2 assists. Doesn't seem like much, right? But anyone who remembers that Botafogo team is sure that Almada was one of the main players that season. He, Igor Jesus, Savarino, and Luis Henrique carried the team. Not to mention they had great chemistry. And when we saw Almada leave Botafogo after only 6 months playing in Brazil, it gave us the feeling that at some point he was going to break out. And we would have a hard time believing that a player of that caliber has played in Brazilian football in recent times. In other words, we see that looking at football from this perspective of simple numbers, like the number of games with goals and assists, often doesn't really reflect what the game was actually like. And that's why we here at Futebol Maximo are here to flip the logic of fantasy games. You're used to playing other games where you pick the players. Their real-life performance impacts the score, and you compete with your friends. The problem is that sometimes there's a guy who plays really well, but he didn't score a goal or give an assist, and then his score goes way down. Our goal is to revolutionize this logic, and our fantasy game is coming soon. On August 2nd, we'll bring more news, but you can sign up here so you don't miss anything. The thing is, when we imagine this situation, with Almada as the regular starting number 10 and Arrascaeta sitting on the bench because of that, it seems crazy. Since the 2025 season was probably Arrascaeta's best season for Flamengo since he arrived, maybe competing with 2019. But there were other main players. But for me, 2025 was the best, because he was decisive on his own. But then we have to consider a few things, right? Arrasca had surgery. He went to the World Cup. Then he had a calf injury. He was out. He didn't play any World Cup games. And now he's coming back to the field, now 97 days later. Besides that, I need to show you a number that really shocked me. Here on Transfer Market, we can see a player's injury history, and this really caught my attention. Since he arrived at Flamengo, it was in this season here. Look, 18, 19, 19, 20 more or less. Here, it's divided by seasons, not by year. He had injuries every season, and I'll say more. In all these seasons, he was out for at least 30 days, with the peak here in the 24-25 season when he was out for 114 days. And for those who will remember, at the end of 2024, when Flamengo wins the Copa do Brasil, there was already a sense that Arrascaeta was declining in his career. Then 2025 comes around and he surprises everyone, with a good run of games and many goals scored. But we have to reach a consensus here, that at 32 years old, the tendency is for us to see Arrascaeta having more and more injury problems, since that's been a constant in his career. I'm not talking here about Arrasca and Virabando, but maybe start getting used to the idea that he won't be available for every game, like he was in the last few years for Flamengo, including in this Flamengo vs Chape match, this return game of the Brasileirão. Take a look at the lineup that Jardim sent to the field. He went with Jorginho and Pulgar as defensive midfielders, Samuel Lino as number 10, then Arrascaeta ended up coming in, Plata on the right, Bruno Henrique on the left, and Pedro as number 9. In other words, we start to consider the possibility that Arrascaeta won't always be available, and that Samuel Lino won't necessarily always play as a left winger. Do you understand where I'm going with this, right? But even so, we have this context where Arrascaeta will be healthy, so Almada could be considered for the right wing. But for me, there are a few more issues here. First point, Almada is a right-footed player who would play on the right. And if his main characteristic is cutting inside to build plays and work in the space between the lines, it seems a bit more wasted to have him cutting outside here on the right, something that Paquetá doesn't do. Precisely because he's left-footed, he tends to cut inside more. In fact, this right wing position at Flamengo has become notable in recent years, because they put players there who cut inside. Paquetá and Carrascal are maybe more like playmakers, while Plata is more of a finisher. And if we look back, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Everton Ribeiro was a star playing here in 2019, and then it gets complicated, right? Where does Almada fit into all of this? And there's an argument I've been hearing a lot. Almada is coming to Flamengo now for 28 million euros, the third most expensive signing of this season in Brazilian football. It trails only Paquetá and Gerson's moves to Cruzeiro. 28 million euros is not an amount for a player who's coming to sit on the bench, and I agree with that. But we have to understand that when it comes to this front four, if Lino goes to the bench, we're talking about a player worth 22 million euros going to the bench. If Paquetá goes to the bench, we're talking about a guy worth 40 million euros going to the bench. In other words, someone expensive will necessarily end up on the bench, but I have some alternatives. Stick with me. I believe that most Flamengo fans see this lineup as the possible starting team, right? The most likely one. Varela, Leo Ortiz, Leo Pereira, and Alexandro. Jorginho and Pulgar. Arrascaeta, Paquetá, Samuel Lino, and Pedro. So far, so good. The problem is, especially when it comes to this front five here, or better yet, let's simplify it, this front four here, ever since Paquetá arrived. This quartet has only been on the field together as starters once so far, in this Flamengo versus Corinthians match here, 8th round, which ended 1-1. That was the only time Paquetá, Arrascaeta, Samuel Lino, and Pedro started together, if we also consider the midfield with Jorginho, and not Pulgar, but Everton Araujo. This quintet, actually this sextet, has never been on the field together, and in this game here, there's still an interesting fact, right? Because Everton Araujo was sent off, Samuel Lino was substituted at 62 minutes, and Arrascaeta also came off at 61. In other words, this quartet wasn't together up front for that long. Pedro was substituted at the 80th minute, then Alassian came on. So, first of all, we have to let go of the idea of this ideal starting lineup that will always play together. The reality is that in recent times, Flamengo hasn't had a very clear starting 11, mostly because of injuries. Arrascaeta has had a lot of injuries, Paquetá has also been struggling with injuries, and why not mention Pedro as well? In the last 2 seasons, he missed 57 games for Flamengo. So, first point, let's get rid of that idea, and I'll start bringing up some interesting points for us to look at on the board. First point, let's suppose this is actually Flamengo's starting lineup. What alternatives could there be, okay? First point, Paquetá coming down to play more deeper in the build-up, and Almada, for example, moving over here. As I've already said, for me, it's not ideal for Almada to be here, because he loses that ability to cut inside. So let's put Paquetá back, and Pulgar here as the defensive midfielder. Arrascaeta, he has increasingly become more of a box-to-box midfielder, a second striker, and at times he has also played in Pedro's position. But at first, I imagine that Almada can play this position quite a lot, while Arrascaeta is still getting back into shape. With everyone healthy, I think the natural thing is for Samuel Lino to be the one to leave, even though he's in excellent form, to make room for Almada. But until we get to that situation, with everyone in good condition, then we'll have to see who's performing better at the moment. Is it Lino? Is it Almada? Is it Arrascaeta? Is it Paquetá? And there's still another alternative. If Pedro is out at some point, I wouldn't think it's absurd to see Arrascaeta play that position, or even Samuel Lino himself emulating Caio Jorge's role, being that forward who runs in behind the defense, who contributes more to the game in that way. Now, when we look at this, we're talking about a lot of quality players. We're talking here about Pedro, Samuel Lino, Arrascaeta, Thiago Almada, Paquetá, Pulgar, Jorginho, and why not? Right, Plata, Saúl, De La Cruz, Carrascal. So we're talking about more than 10 players. And what worries me in this context is that when we look at this lineup, whether it's with Lino on the left or with Almada, we have to understand that the main characteristic of these wingers is to play more inside, whether it's at the start of the play to help build up the play or getting into the box to finish, mainly because they're 2 wingers playing as inverted wingers, and that's the big concern. Why is Flamengo spending 28 million euros on a winger, since Flamengo already has many players for that position? When the idea is to play with these wingers coming inside, and especially if the winger plays inside, the fullback has to play wide. Jardim did this a lot at Cruzeiro. He demanded a lot from Kaique, Willian, and Fagner, and all the players who played there, precisely because the wingers would cut inside, especially on the right with Christian, but also on the left with Wanderson, who interchanged a lot with Kaique. And when we look at this Flamengo squad, Flamengo doesn't have many players who play that role. Varela can even get forward, but that's not his main characteristic. Flamengo's best left back is Alexandro, a technically gifted player. But he also doesn't have that same drive anymore. Ayrton Lucas does have it, but he doesn't deliver as much consistency. So does it really make sense to spend 28 million on a winger when you actually needed a full back to play that role? But when it comes to Flamengo, we know anything can happen. Money isn't an issue there. Leave your comment and let's do this imagination exercise. Suggest a realistic South American signing, whether they're here or in Europe. Who could return? Who would be your left back to play alongside Almada or Samuel Lino over there? Last season they tried Kaique, who I think would be a perfect fit, but I need to be honest. Luciano Juba would fit perfectly in that role. Juba knows how to play as a center back when building from the back, as a defensive midfielder in a more advanced build-up, play more inside, or attack from the outside as well. For me, he's the most complete left back in Brazilian football, and to be honest, Flamengo should go after him.